Good morning and welcome to the review for the World War II test. Thought I'd make this quick video, or not so quick video, for you guys. Go over some of the topics and kind of remind you what you have to focus on. The key is to remember that as we were getting ready to go to World War II, you had the Great Depression going on worldwide, and that set the stage for a lot of what was happening. Remember also that it was the Treaty of Versailles that really crushed Germany after World War I, and the terms of that treaty allowed Hitler to rise to power, along with everything that was going on with the Great Depression worldwide. Remember, while the world was building up to World War II, you had two trains of thought. You had the interventionists and you had the isolationists. And those two ideas or philosophies really affected U.S. foreign policy, like we have here. The Neutrality Acts, you don't have to know them, but understand how they started with us being fairly neutral, and by the end we had changed sides. And the little picture down here in the corner is of the Destroyers for Bases Act. We talked about that in class. So the United States had an official philosophy, and by the run-up to the war, we're almost getting in 1941, we're almost in the war, we had a totally different take unofficially. You have to remember that while planning all of this into your test questions and answers. Remember who the bad guys were in the war. You have the Japanese in Asia and the Pacific. You have Nazi Germany rising in Europe, and Italy helping out in both Spain and North Africa. So these were the three groups, three countries that were causing issues. And remember, they were the Axis powers. Remember, in Europe, where World War II started, you have in 1939 Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact where they don't like each other, but they agree they're not going to fight. That allows for Germany to invade Poland. Once that happens, you have Great Britain and France declare war on Germany, which Hitler wasn't sure that was going to happen because of the policy of appeasement. Remember what appeasement was, where Germany kept doing things violating the Treaty of Versailles, and Great Britain and France didn't do anything because they were afraid to start a war and thought if they just gave in to Hitler's demands, there would be no war, and it would make him happy. They declare war, and then you have what's called the phony war, where from September until May, there's no major battles. Both sides ramp up, both sides get their men ready to fight, nothing happens. And then in May, Germany attacks France and the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, and just wreaks havoc in Europe. That sets everything in motion. Keep in mind, you have in Asia Japan attacking, and the purpose was for natural resources. They took over Manchuria, called it Manchukuo, a big chunk of China. They took French Indochina, and were attacking into Asia for natural resources because Japan, being an island nation, doesn't have very many resources. It's very limited in size, and you can only get natural resources from what you can pull out of the ground. They're limited. So they attacked into Asia, and that's took a big chunk, along with they went further out here into the Pacific, trying to build a barrier. Remember, we talked about this in class, to keep the United States away. The United States is way over here. To keep the United States away from them. Now in Europe, you have to remember that this hadn't occurred yet. This was the USSR. And Germany didn't attack there. They just went into Poland, and then they swept into Denmark and through the Low Countries into France. That left the United Kingdom standing by itself rather quickly into the war. Also at the time, Greece was not taken over. But that's beside the point. At one point, all of Europe was run by Axis powers, with the exception of Spain, which was an ally who were fascist. Remember, Italy and Germany helped put Spain, Francisco Franco, in power. So you have basically the whole continent of Europe friendly to the Axis powers. And the United States is still not involved in the war, so the United Kingdom or Great Britain is standing by itself. This takes us up to Pearl Harbor, which was December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. It brought us into World War II. Hitler went ballistic. He didn't want Japan attacking us. You just have to understand that Admiral Yamamoto, understood that if he didn't take us out of the war right away, once we got up, our production capabilities would be the downfall of Japan. And he did turn out to be right. We talked about that in class. But Pearl Harbor is the day that brings us into World War II. We talked about the Neutrality Acts in class in the run-up to World War II. We also have these two acts, the Lend-Lease and the Atlantic Charter. Basically, even though we were staying neutral, we had chosen a side. And you have to understand which side we chose going into the war and why we had chosen that side. We weren't actively participating, but we were doing all we could to help the side we wanted to win. And the Lend-Lease Act and the Atlantic Charter, along with destroyers for bases, showed people, if they were paying attention, we had chosen sides going into the war. After Pearl Harbor, you have to understand that a number of things happened in the United States. We were already gearing up for the war, so that was something we didn't have to worry about. But you have the internment camps. Understand the difference between American internment camps and German concentration camps. In the United States, you have issues of war bonds. We're constantly selling bonds to finance the war. We have rationing going on full scale, and these two things are brought together by propaganda. And actually, the internment camps, if you remember what we talked about with Dr. Seuss and Cartoons Go to War, you have the issues of propaganda that arise with Japanese Americans and the war effort. And once again, we talked about our industrial capacity and how that helps us throughout the war. Each year is broken down into three sections: the Pacific, the European theater, and the home front. So, in your notes, make sure you have the information such as, in 1942, we had the Bataan Death March. This was our first full year in the war. You have to understand what happened in April of 1942. And we also have the in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway, which is a positive. we didn't do much in Europe. Excuse me. We did have the bombings of France. And you also have, in North Africa, our campaign with Operation Torch. Home front, we're focusing more on things. The home front, we're focusing more on things such as rationing, its importance in the war effort. Along with rationing, we have the tie-in with black market goods. And you have Enrico Fermi splitting the atom, which this goes along with the Manhattan Project. The other issues we don't really need to talk about. 1943 in the Pacific. We have island hopping. Understand the reason why we chose the strategy of island hopping. We have Operation Vengeance, which was very important when it came to taking out the top admiral of the Japanese Navy. And you have over in the European theater Operation Mincemeat and Operation Husky, which deal with the planned invasion of Sicily. You also have bombing around the clock of Germany by the Allies, which shows air superiority. On the home front, you have signs of unrest during the war. FDR has to freeze wages and prices, but you also have race riots break out in some of the larger U.S. cities. Detroit was one of them. In L.A., you have the Zoot Suit riots break out, which are also riots that are split the people along racial lines, ethnic lines. And you have some of the propaganda, the Fuhrer's face, we talked briefly about. You get into the use of stereotypes and caricatures to define our enemies, which kind of goes along with the theme of the racial tensions that are causing issues in the United States during this time period and really come to the forefront in the 50s and 60s. In the Pacific Theater, the victories for the United States keep increasing. We're pushing the Japanese back further and further. General Tojo resigns as general and as Prime Minister of Japan. In Europe, we finally have D-Day occur, which with D-Day, we finally get our troops close to Germany on the continent. That starts collapsing the German front from both sides. You have the Soviets pushing in from the east. We're pushing up through Italy from the south, and we have troops now in France. Along with that, you have some of the German super weapons, the V-1 rockets, the V-2 rockets. You have some assassination attempts on Hitler we talked about. We also have some other super weapons, such as the German jet fighters. We're not going to talk about that too much. That might be more of a what-if question. And D-Day occurs, understand when D-Day happened, which was in June. But by August of 1944, Paris is liberated from the Germans. You have some last-ditch German attempts at offensives, the Battle of the Bulge, and you also have Heinrich Himmler, one of the higher-ups in German government, start having the concentration camps destroyed, which shows that they're trying to cover up the crimes they were committing, which comes into play with the Nuremberg trials. And on the home front, you have the propaganda continuing, and in this case with 1944, telling the women that they're equal and doing just as good a job as the men, and how they're needed, which sets up conflicts after the war when women are told, you're no longer needed, go home. 1945, the last year for the war. check your notes. The questions you answered deals with the European theater, both the Potsdam Conference, the Yalta Conference, what Operation Unthinkable was, the Nuremberg trials. We didn't touch on this much, but Mussolini was killed. That plays into Hitler's train of thought. Because Mussolini, he was killed by his own people. His body was put on display. They weren't happy with him. Hitler did not want that end to come to him. And then we have, in February and March, Iwo Jima, that battle with the Marines and death toll. We talked about that in detail. Watch the video. Then we have Okinawa, which happened April through June, and that pretty much set the mindset for the Americans that they were going to use the atomic bombs from the Manhattan Project to end the war with Japan. Terms you need to know: VE Day and VJ Day. On the home front, we had the American people finding out about the atomic weapons, and you have the death of FDR during his 4th term. That rounds out the war. The death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt plays into post-war politics because FDR, who'd been around for forever in American politics since the early 30s, is no longer there. You have Truman, who takes the place of him, having issues with Stalin, which causes some grief and issues amongst the American public whenever they realize that our ally of World War II, the Soviet Union, is no longer our ally. That, along with the atomic weapons, scares the living daylights out of people. So you have issues that set up the post-war, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next unit. Any questions, please email me. Talk to you guys later.